Apple, so nice to have you back with us. And we're just going to be able to witness a conversation around some of the thinking you all have been doing for a book that's sort of in progress. And if it wanders off into other topics, wonderful. So very conversational, very dialogical, and we're so glad to have you here with us.
All right, it is good to be home. It really is. So this will be a combination of both of us talking separately and both of us talking to each other and to you, okay? It started out with an issue that has been plaguing me for the last 50 years, and that is whether there's any relative autonomy within schools that can make a difference, whether schools can actually be used for social transformation. And it quickly became more complicated, trying to understand, does a state function? Does the state always follow the needs of capital? Is the state a racial state? Of course. Is it always a racial state? Of course. Does it act on that in complicated ways? Yes. Can we predict it? Sort of. Right? And also a worry about some postmodern theories that are profoundly important for understanding and offer us almost no help whatsoever in interrupting dominance and subordination involving things such as political economy. And I think it's a loss of, it's sort of historical amnesia. It's if it's a replacement strategy. And that worries the hell out of me. Though anyone who's read any of my books knows that I've been influenced about identity theories and about the politics of discourse. So I don't want to dismiss that at all. I want us to remember, for instance, that Foucault was an AIDS activist and spent his life sacrificing a good deal to fight back. And that may not be as visible in his rhetorical understandings, though he's brilliant. But I'm trying to figure out what is it that schools can do and what are the kinds of tools. And one of my teachers on how this is possible around issues of religion and in England and other nations is Reza. So we have been talking for many times, both here over the last few days, but also when I was a visiting faculty member in Birmingham and elsewhere. So we've been involved in a book that is a sequel to the book, Can Education Change Society? My sort of first foray into trying to figure that out. And the book is called, Does the Right Always Win? And it's a question that says, yes, social mobilizations and social movements around the right are transforming the state, are transforming civil society, are transforming gender hierarchies, are defending things that are indefensible. Thank you, Robin Voss. I'll try and offend everyone. Though with this audience, I don't think I'm going to be offending any. So part of the task for the book is to take seriously some of the theoretical and political insights that have been driving us. Let me give a couple. As some of you know, I've been influenced very strongly by Stuart Hall, by Gramsci, and the distinction that Gramsci makes is between a war of position and a war of maneuver. A war of maneuver is World War I. You're in trenches on that side. I'm in trenches on this side. We all have guns and we shoot. If Lynn is left standing, you win. So it's a frontal assault. Forgive the masculinist metaphors that go with this. You know, Gramsci. And a war of position is about culture and struggles and the place of that. That is the place of common sense, the place of everyday understandings, the place of daily life, and the way people understand their world. And he makes a claim that in times now with unpredictability with state functions, with class being fractured, that the left has to get more serious, whatever the left means, around issues of the place of cultural struggles. So part of this is ratified as well by Nancy Fraser's work arguing very, very strongly that it's not just a question of redistribution that we must be concerned with. It's questions of recognition and questions of representation. And that the task of anyone who wants to use schools for social transformation is to look at what are the connections among those three sites, discursively, politically, in terms of mobilizations, etc., and to see what is it that can connect these kinds of struggles together and form alliances that are hard to build, but can interrupt the right. So the book takes these insights and says, look, the right is really complicated. There's not one story you can tell about it. Sometimes it's about class. Sometimes it's about race. It's almost always about race in many ways. Sometimes, as we'll see from Reza's stuff, it's about religious forms and a different kind of understanding, which is ratified in my own analysis of the place of Christian nationalism, for instance, right now, as we're seeing throughout the United States, in Kenya, in Ghana, and in many, many other places. So we've chosen a variety of countries, and this is the first book of many. And I know there are silences and gaps in the countries we have chosen to try and figure out, how do we act back? What is the right doing? What's the complexity of the right? It's not always the same damn thing. It's a sort of complicated hegemonic block, and I'll talk for a minute about that in a second. And we chose the US, in part because if we can't understand where the hell we are, why are we doing this? So I love comparative work, and part of the task in this is comparisons of what the right is doing and how we interrupt it. England, since the empire has come home. Australia, because the empire invaded. And both of us have done work in Australia. Poland, we wanted Hungary, but everyone's frightened to death about writing about stuff about Poland right now. So we have some dissident groups writing on Poland. Brazil, as some of you know, I've been working in Brazil since 1986, the last year of the military government. And as you know from Bolsonaro, the military has not left, it's ready. It could change and kick Lula out at any moment. So this is serious business. Chile, since again, even though there supposedly has been a constitutional change that threw out the right, the new constitution has been rejected. And it's very similar to what's going on about Bolsonaro in Brazil, in that for many, many people who we would predict would not be in favor of rightist mobilizations because of religious impulses in part and theologies of prosperity and US funding for ultra-conservative Christian nationalism in Brazil, it now is voting for Bolsonaro. So similar things are going on. We wanted to represent that. And then finally, Japan, where some people on the left, including some students of mine, are arguing very strongly that there are resources that can be taken from the right to interrupt the right. Okay? That's a really interesting argument, and I think we have to take that seriously. Okay. We had wanted and had been accepted by someone who is a Muslim activist within India, who is an assistant professor at JNU and also at the University of Delhi. And she's been warned she will not get promoted if she says publicly anything that is wrong. And it reminded me what it's like to be a woman, to be seen as marginalized population in that nation right now. And she has had to withdraw. Okay. I say this because this work is not neutral, as if there's a lot of neutrality in educational research anyway. But this is also threatening to many people. And as some of you know, when I spoke out against the military dictatorship in Korea, and was arrested immediately and pulled off from the stage and thrown in jail. I don't mean that to say I'm special, but having lived through what it means when there are oppressive circumstances, this stuff has returned in powerful ways. So let me say a couple more things and then we can start the conversation, okay? There is not one thing about the right. Those of you who know my work, especially things like educating the right way, know that I am very dissatisfied, as is Reza and many people, especially some people in this room who have been my teachers about how this works nationally and internationally. Anyone who thinks that right is one thing is not paying attention. Following Gramsci, there's a new hegemonic bloc. It is filled with compromises, and there are 4 groups in it if we can talk about ideal types. One is neoliberals. If we think of this as an umbrella, they're the main hand holding the umbrella. And basically they think one thing: private is good and public is bad. You can see that in terms of what's going on in the legislature right now, where money is being stolen from this university and from public schools that will go to private schools and religious schools. And it's not just Oklahoma that will put in place huge amounts of money for religious schools. We are an outlier. Brazil spends a lot of money already for religious schools. They believe in a small, strong, in a weak state. That's the fiction. It is not a weak state at all. All we can see and all we have to do is to look at the money taken from welfare payments, etc., to build new prisons. So 1 out of every 4 African-American young men has been or will be under the control of the injustice system. It's 1 out of every 17 Latinx. That's a complicated phrase. I know that some people don't like it. So I will deconstruct my use of it, and you can criticize me later on, but it's an argument we can have later on about that. But this vision that neoliberals actually want a weak state is a fiction. States act by negative selection. So choosing not to do certain things signifies strong states just as well. Then there are neoconservatives. Neoconservatives believe in a strong state, especially over cultural forms, women's bodies, gay and lesbian bodies, trans bodies in many ways. They want a national curriculum in which they decide. Okay. A third element, which is now in leadership in the US Congress, among the racist nationalists, and that is what we might call, following Stuart Hall, authoritarian populists. It's a group that believe that people must decide, but there's good people and bad people. It's the religious right. And whether we like it or not, the fastest growing school reform in the United States is not charters. It is not vouchers. It is homeschooling. 5 million students have been pulled out of even religious schools, and gated communities of the mind, as well as the physical gated community, now are the emerging new schools. And interestingly, the fastest growing segment of that are minoritized people. So we have to begin to think about what's the role of religious forms here, and how do people get pulled under the leadership of that umbrella. Finally, people who would vote for Obama, but who would never, ever vote for Trump, but are still lending their expertise, are members of the managerial and new middle class, who believe one simple thing: if it moves in classrooms, measure it. And if it hasn't moved yet, measure it anyway in case it moves tomorrow. You don't need the right for that. In fact, many people on the left believe that extremely well. So there's this tense alliance. So we're trying to figure out, using these case studies, how does it work? What are the dynamics in different places? Because there'll be different groups in these 4 that are powerful. So Brazil is not Chile. The US is not England. Okay. One of the things we're trying to do now is to say, look, so here's the elements as ideal types. Can we now look at what is going on? So we validate this theoretically and empirically. And at the same time, can we look at the resistances, the struggles, the wars of position in each of these, and what can we learn? So as an example, and I'm almost done, are hybrid alliances possible? Is there any way I should be working, or we should be working, with rightist populist groups against neoliberalism? That's heretical, but that's what I'm doing. So we want to think about, can we think a bit outside the box about whether alliances that are temporary can actually do some things? I'm scared of that, even though I'm doing it, okay? All of this is to try and then take the right seriously, because the question, can education change society, is already being answered by the right. Why are we still asking that? The right is winning. Just look at Modi in India, okay? So I'm tired of the question. So I want to look at what can the right teach us about using schools and other cultural sites for interrupting more progressive things, and what are the ways in which, looking at multiple nations, we can understand how to fight back and answer the question of who is the we, which is the most dangerous word in any of the languages represented here. So how can we build a new we that actually responds? So one of the chapters that has been teaching me a lot is Reza's about religion, Muslim interruptions, in a place that has sort of a strong state, sort of. For a while was my wife, my second home, and that was England. And since he doesn't drink, I don't want to see him anymore. It's one of the reasons I go there is to drink Guinness. But anyway, I went all that time without a shitty joke. People should be applauded about that. Anyway, so let me now turn it over to start the conversation then with with my dear friend Reza about what he is doing, and use that to. Right? And seriously, anytime you have a question, just interrupt. Okay, it's supposed to be not just a conversation between the two of us, but also, right? There are too many people here who have been continue to be my teachers about these kinds of things. So,
thanks, Mike. Firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be here to meet all of you, and it's an honor of unspeakable magnitude to sit next to Mike and be called his friend. It's Mike is a superhero and certainly a hero of mine.
It took me a lot of checks for people to say that.
So, as you've alluded to, Mike asked me specifically to think about issues to do with sort of more broadly the role of religions into the contemporary political setups in the UK, and specifically about Muslim minoritized communities in the UK, and to contribute to the book from that perspective. So if it's okay, I'll say just a bit about that and about the chapter, and then hopefully we can have a conversation around the bigger questions around the right, and also what can be done in schools. What should schools do? Because I'm absolutely convinced that one of the things all of us absolutely must do is to do engaged collaborative research with communities and schools in a kind of a multi-stakeholder kind of setup, and I'm happy to talk about that later. But the issues that I sort of deal with in the chapter, inevitably they sort of center on the question of Islamophobia. Which has been and continues to be a central issue, I think, in many Western global North countries, but also outside of the West, as a lot of research, including some of my own, has shown. The first issue to think about, I think, is why is it even important to pay attention to Islamophobia? Why should anyone who cares about education care about Islamophobia, right? And I think there's at least two reasons for that, why it's important to focus particularly on Islamophobia rather than sort of broadly anti-racism or that kind of discourse. The first has to do with the fact that at a very kind of basic, nitty-gritty, everyday level, students of Muslim backgrounds at all levels of education in the UK, but also in many other parts of the world, are markedly more disadvantaged, significantly more disadvantaged in terms of their educational experiences and outcomes than any other group, pretty much. And we now, in the UK, for the first time, have official data, released by an official body backed by the government. The Higher Education Statistics Agency released, loads of data a few years ago. I wrote a paper on it as well, which again just pretty much confirms what we've all known, and what I suspect is also true here and in Canada and in many parts of Europe and in Australia and so on and so forth. So that's one area. And as I talk about in the chapter, that's not sort of accidental. That's not just part of what we understand broadly as minoritization. There's something specific about either being a Muslim or being perceived to be a Muslim that brings about that kind of unique disadvantage, educational disadvantage. And the second, perhaps more subtle, but equally important, if not more important issue, why should we pay attention to Islamophobia, is education itself. Education as an idea, as a kind of practice or a set of practices. Education as a kind of a site for policy assemblage. I would argue, and I'm beginning to make that argument in the chapter that I've written for this book, that education itself has become a central factor in how Islamophobia is today manufactured and rationalized. And so it's absolutely essential that we pay attention to how that works. How is education being taken up and used both as a concept, but also as a set of tools, etc. Essentially to perpetuate, to manufacture and perpetuate Islamophobia. So it's those two issues which I think sort of really warrant doing research and writing and practice on Islamophobia. The next set of questions is around, well, what is it? What are we even talking about? When we say Islamophobia, everyone has some kind of an understanding, but what does it mean? And I think perhaps that's maybe that's less important as a question. I'm a sociologist of education. I don't see my job being, coming up with exhaustive definitions for things. I don't think really necessarily that's important or even possible. I don't see what use that has analytically. However, it is important to pay attention, as Mike said, to what's happening in the here and now, to understand the contemporary dynamics of our societies, to be able to kind of make sense of them in relation to the past and perhaps say something about future trajectories. So I think to that extent, it's worth taking up the debate of what is it and how do we define it. And there's sort of two camps that I find myself in, let's say, heated dialogue, critical debate with, quite heated sometimes, who sort of weighed in on this debate. The first camp it sort of comprises very powerful people, including politicians, in the UK and elsewhere, academics, journalists, people with big platforms. And they are of the belief that we know exactly what Islamophobia is. In fact, there's a definition that is officially taken up by the UK's all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia. It's been taken up by many local governments in the UK, and it is therefore used to devise policy, right? And that definition is so, it's a two-word definition. Islamophobia equals anti-Muslim racism. That's it, right? And I'm happy to talk about that more, but I'm conscious of time. There is a slightly longer kind of, they open it up and but essentially it boils down to the fact that we know exactly what it is. It's racism, except it's anti-Muslim racism. So we've understood exactly what Islamophobia is. Now let's get on, with the business of dealing with it, as it were. I'm not quite convinced, as I talk about in the book, and I've talked about in other works. But that's the first camp. The second camp are also academics, sometimes journalists, other people, perhaps less powerful than the first camp. But these are people who say, let's get rid of the word altogether. We shouldn't be using the word Islamophobia at all, because, well, one, it creates a hierarchy of oppression. It begins to kind of split anti-racist alliances. And actually what it does in a liberal democracy is that it ends up kind of precluding, legitimate criticisms of religion and religiosity. So I think both camps are wrong. I don't know, but I'm not convinced by either. The first one, is it racism? there's absolutely no doubt that certainly in the global north and in sort of white majority countries that, you know, and also I shouldn't just say white majority countries, in India as well, probably, and China perhaps. There's absolutely no doubt that racism is central to Islamophobia. You know, in terms of both sort of phenotypical differences, you know, colorism, but also cultural racism, absolutely central. There's no doubt about that. So I'm not denying the existence of racism. My argument is that if you focus only on that aspect of it, there is what Amina Gaffer-Kucher called religification, which is completely lost in that conversation. And when you speak to any number of people who are under receiving end of Islamophobia, the very first things they tell you is that I'm being discriminated for my religious beliefs. And now, especially since the Conservative government came to power in 2010 in the UK, you know, and Islamophobia and other forms of prejudice just went on steroids, absolutely. Because there's nothing, I think essentially right-wing about Islamophobia. It existed also under the, you know, the left-wing governments, including Tony Blair's, which was quite progressive in many ways, but the right have taken it to a whole new stratosphere. It's the belief aspect, the fact that people's beliefs, their form of spiritualism, their practice of religion, that has become problematized. We now begin to see evidence of that in policy as well. So the UK's counterterrorism policy, which is the government is very proud of, in fact, it calls itself the world leader in counterterrorism, and perhaps rightly so, because many countries have essentially copy-pasted the UK's model. You know, in Scandinavia and Australia, they've pretty much just taken that model and said, yes, this will work for us. We'll just do that. And education is key in that. But one of the things that David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, did was that he made a subtle but very crucial change in that policy, which was that the focus on violent extremism shifted to a focus on violent or extremist ideology. And that opened a door to essentially problematizing belief and anything that you might believe, you know, which we think is potentially problematic. And then that went hand in hand with a government mandated and defined set of so-called fundamental British values, which is a whole other can of worms. So that's the issue. It's the religification that is missing, and it's the perception and the ascription of Muslimness on people, which then ends up problematizing them. And as I said, as for the second camp, this idea of a hierarchy of oppression and legitimate criticisms of religion, I don't accept that at all. I mean, the British sociologist Tariq Modood has written a very interesting paper where he identifies, I mean, he sort of sets out almost like a 5-point test, you know, by the application of which you can gauge whether or not a statement is Islamophobic or if it's actually meant to be a genuine criticism of religion. Now, I'm not saying that we should be devising tests for that sort of thing. The point is simply that there are ways of ensuring that what is absolutely necessary in a democracy, which is the ability to criticize religions and, you know, any belief, that remains intact, you know, without breaking up alliances or without sort of people saying, well, actually, you're stopping us from speaking out. So I argue in the chapter then that certainly as I view it, Islamophobia is manufactured and rationalized fear of anybody who's perceived to be Muslim. And this, I mean, the word phobia, then it doesn't kind of make sense because it makes it sound like it's an irrational fear, but actually the way that policies work, I would argue, we've come to a point now where it makes sense to fear Muslims, you know, the narrative and which is backed up certainly in the UK by policy moves, makes it completely sensical, rational, right? It's on the back of this idea that, you know, people who are Muslim, you know, or who we believe to be Muslim are essentially inimical to our civilization. They will never adhere to our cultures or values. They're always going to be different and they're always potentially dangerous, right? And this has become so part of the kind of fabric of everyday culture almost that believing otherwise might put one at odds with the dominant narrative and with the dominant discourse. And as I said, counter-terror laws have been absolutely central in that. And counter-terror laws themselves have worked hand in hand with the idea of education, right? So I mean, and that's consistent globally as well. I mean, you look at, for example, China and what's happening in the Xinjiang province. That is perhaps the most brutal manifestation of this sort of policy. It is literally called re-education. It's about re-education. So there are re-education camps, which are huge, huge prisons. And in these prisons are upward of 1 million people, all of them from Muslim backgrounds. For the simple reason that they are Muslims and they are accused by the Chinese government of being separatists or being potentially prone to extremism, and therefore they are un-Chinese. So what we do, in a very friendly way, nobody wants to do anybody any harm. We're just going to take them. This is not a prison. It's about citizenship education, and it's a program of citizenship education. So these, over 1 million people, most of them men, but also women and children, are then interned in these re-education camps and essentially taught to be proper Chinese, as it were. And that's an educational endeavor. In the UK, it doesn't look quite as brutal as that, obviously. But the PREVENT program has, since its inception, been what the government called a support program. The idea is once, again, through the school system, and the school system is has the highest statistics of referrals to the government anti-terror program, which is called Channel. So essentially, what a teacher has to do is if they suspect any student of any age of a risk of radicalization, they can refer that student, and they must by law now refer that student, and then that student might then go through the Channel program. So that's the idea. Once you get referred to this program, then the government sets up a tailor-made support program for you, which again is about supporting you off the wrong path and onto the right path, and teaching you how to be a proper British citizen. And my good friend Vinnie Lander and Francis Farrell have written an excellent paper on that, where they talk about the sort of the disciplinary aspect of that aspect of the PREVENT program. So again, education remains at the heart of that as well. And then the final point really to make is around, I think, secularism, which again we miss if we just go in and just look at only questions of race, right? Because once you factor in the religification issue, then you can begin to really question, well, what are the other factors at play here, right? And secularism as a modality of power, it keeps coming up again and again, and it's really interesting to look at. And this poses another challenge, I think, for me and perhaps also for Mike, because then this is something that seems to cut across a lot of governments in the world, as I've said, China, India, Japan, but also European and North American ones, irrespective of their kind of political positioning. They seem to have a lot of these kind of methods in common, and these themes around education and a kind of a secularized argument for putting them forward seems to be a consistent in that as well. I'll say very quickly something about secularism, if that's okay, Mike, just a couple of points why it's important. So the first one, in case of Muslim citizens, and remember, these are people who are born and raised in Britain or the US or whatever country they reside in. They are British for all intents and purposes. It's just that they're written out of the dominant narrative, and they're sort of problematized in that way. The brilliant thinker Charles Taylor wrote a magnificent book, I think in 2007, called A Secular Age. Some of you nodding, I think some of you are familiar with it. So in that book, he makes a very, very elegant, very simple observation, which is that the difference between Europe today, or the West, I suppose, by extension today, and Europe 500 years ago, is that today we have a choice. Individuals today can choose to live a religious life and be fulfilled by it, or can choose to live a non-religious life, a secular life, and also be fulfilled by it, right? So 500 years ago, wherever you went in society, you would meet God. God would be there. But today we have, through secularism, what Jose Casanova would call structural differentiation. So all institutions work according to their own logic, rather than they're not answerable to the Bible anymore. And that's a choice that individuals can exercise. And I think that's absolutely correct, except today, as we sit here, I'm not sure if that choice applies to Muslim citizens in the same way. Imagine yourself as a pious, practicing Muslim person living in a secular country that's supposed to give you that choice. right? Now, 5 minutes later, when you walk out the door to go to work or whatever, all of that goes out the window because you realize very quickly that your dearly held private belief is being yanked, kind of kicking and screaming into the public sphere constantly, through secular policy, through secular discourse, right? It's becoming effectively deprivatized. And that goes against the kind of, the edicts of secularism, as we're told, which is about the privatization of religion, which of course is, it's never the case, but that's what they say, right? So in the case of Muslims, their religion is always already publicized in that sense, right? And a lot of students actually at university find this when they arrive at university that, 18, 19 years of age, they've grown up in a family setting, which has been all about, my faith is my spirituality. It's just very, very near and dear to me. It's got nothing to do with anybody else. And, from one day to the next, they find themselves, suddenly everything about them has become politicized and they now have to take positions, defend them, or not. And it's a very difficult experience for them. And of course, with that is also how secularism works through institutional practices in a kind of almost a silent way in the taken for granted culture is what Carol Vinson calls a detheologized Christian culture. And there's excellent examples of that in the school systems. I cite one study in the chapter from Denmark, where Denmark, a largely secular country, but where the Lutheran Church is the national church and receives state funding and is quite powerful in that sense. So most Danish people, according to this study, and I used to live in Denmark when I was very young, so I can test it as myself. I mean, they have a very relaxed attitude towards religion, and they say, well, you shouldn't really make a fuss when it comes to these things. It's just, and Gilliam calls it relaxed religiosity. And so the expectation is that other religions, other minoritized religions, have to display the same attitude if they want to integrate into Danish society. So if you take your religion too seriously, right, then that's it. I mean, you're a problem, and you're a burden, and you're refusing to integrate, and you're a problem immigrant. And what are you even doing here? Like, if you want to live here, so you should relax your religiosity, because that's what we do, right? And it's the same. It's the same thing that Carol Vinson talks about. And the final thing, though, which makes everything really complicated about secularism, is that it's like a double-edged sword, because clearly it's a form of power that works in the ways that I've talked about. But there's also, hardline minority communities and minority groups, some hardline Sunni Muslim groups, for example, or Christian evangelical groups, and all sorts of other minority religious groups, who are now, putting forward arguments which would counter what I would say is social justice. And they're using secularism as a way to kind of couch those demands. So it seems to work both ways as well. So it's no longer about, well, we often sadly have protests outside of schools in London or in Birmingham, where religious groups, it's only the Muslims that grab the headline, but there's also Orthodox Jewish groups and also evangelical Christian groups who protest, certain LGBTQ inclusion of materials in curricula and so on. And the arguments they put forward are no longer religious based. They're no longer about, well, this is an affront to my religion or to God or whatever. They're actually completely secular arguments around, well, actually the school should be a neutral place. The school is a depoliticized place. The school is not raced, it's not gendered, it's not sexed, it shouldn't be anything. The school should just be a school, right? And they have the government to back them up on that, because that's exactly what the government says about schools, right? So this is the issue with secularism. It poses a whole host of interesting but also incredibly vexing questions. Thanks.
I just want people to notice what's behind this, okay? But 2 or 3 key questions that we have to ask if we're serious about the role of schooling in interrupting dominance and subordination. What are the dynamics? So there's been an explosion, and it's because of social mobilizations and movements that I want to applaud. There's been an explosion of what used to be, well, if we take the early Peter McLaren, which I prefer not to take at all anyway, it's all about class all the time, right? Marx solved it, that's it. Well, we now know that class is fractured and very complicated, right? And it is intersected by all kinds of things. including the politics of the body and sexuality. And I won't go, all of these need to be supported. Okay, that's not my point. However, what are the criteria we want to use to say this is a constitutive structure of dominance and subordination, and do we want to assume that they are all equal? My opinion is we don't know yet, and the only way to find out is to act. So I'm a critical pragmatist about these kinds of things. And in the stuff that I did in Can Education Change Society on the tasks of the critical scholar activist, one of the things that I say is you cannot answer this question unless you are an activist in these movements. Okay, so the answer to this, the question is, to what extent are religious understandings and struggles powerful? And must they be treated as, in many situations, equal to relations of class, to relations of gender, to other forms of subordination? The political economist in me says be very, very careful about that. On the other hand, when I'm working with the folks who were arrested with me in Korea were all evangelicals. And their point was, Jesus worked with the poor and sacrificed his life for humanity. What right do I have to challenge their motivation? So behind this, the reason I've begun talking about this is a very difficult question. So can I understand Modi in India without Hindu nationalism as a primary form? Is it equivalent to caste? Now, those of you who know me know that I've been working in Kerala State on issues of gender specificities with my wife, Rima, who's in women's studies and women's health. So in order to understand why the government is so powerfully involved in this, it's about caste, and it's also, these are people who are not Hindu. They're unscheduled tribal folks in many ways. So, so part of this conversation that we have to ask all of us is, to what extent, what are the insights we need, and who are the agents then of social transformation? So if it's religious, if we now give secularization a label of this is a major dynamic that is oppressive, what does that mean for the kinds of analyses we want to give, and who our allies will be, and who the agents are? Okay? Let me give that example. And then Reza, if you want, just jump in about the examples you would use as well. Many of you may know about this thing that is in US schools, in 43% of all US schools, called Channel One. It's no longer there, and I'll explain why it's no longer there. Channel One was a for-profit television program where you got 10 minutes of news through hip-hop dressed folks, and 2 minutes of obligatory commercials. It's turned on by a computer, and the school got $70,000 worth of equipment. Television screens, monitors for each classroom, and they could use the $70,000 that they would normally spend on AV material, this stuff, like AV. Don't laugh at me for that. You could then not fire your art teacher. And since Los Angeles hasn't hired an art teacher in years and years and years, in essence. So this is a real issue. The students didn't watch the news, they did watch the commercials. That's really interesting. And in many ways, it was students are compelled to be consumers. Okay? They're treated as future buyers. In this state, I was working with 28 school districts with a group that was ultra-conservative evangelicals. And they thought I had a horn and a tail. And they said, children are made in God's image. They should not be bought and sold for profit. I was not theologically aligned with them, but I don't want kids being forced to watch commercials in schools. That's the ultimate neoliberalization of identity and performance. You don't need Stephen Ball performativity to understand that teachers are under threat by that in many, many ways. Okay, though Stephen Ball is a very smart guy. So we agreed to try and get out Channel 1 from all schools in Wisconsin. That worked. Channel 1 is now bankrupt. It's in no schools. So by looking at these kinds of things, that is, that religion is not simply a mark of oppression, even among groups of people who are part of Christian nationalist movements. And FRSA is working with various Muslim groups
And non-Muslims.
and non-Muslim groups, right? Often trying to form alliances. Was this good? And this is what I mean about the practical implications of trying to figure out what are the ways and what are the dynamics we have to consider if we are serious about the school as a site of struggle and about actual practical and programmatic interruptions to not just deal theoretically with the agenda, but also to actually have effects. So how would I interrupt Modi? How would I interrupt the religious justification for Bolsonaro? Is it automatic that people in the United States who are deeply religious will now back Donald Trump? Are there religious forms? I don't think so. Right? So again, you forgive me for going on about this, but one of the things I think we have to talk about if we are serious about the politics of education and the reality that we are trying to interrupt is exactly those things. I'll stop.